In 399 BCE, in the city-state of Athens, a 70-year-old man is summoned to the city's courthouse to face trial. The charge is twofold. 1. The rejection of the gods of the city-state. 2. The corruption of the youth of Athens. The man, who has engaged the citizens of the city with his philosophical dilemmas and questions, has drawn the ire of those he has engaged in dialogue, and is now faced with justifying the practicing of his philosophy. And if he should fail, his philosophy may very well cost him his life. The man that stands accused is Socrates, and this is one of philosophy's greatest stories. Born around 470 BCE, Socrates is often considered the founder or instigator of Western philosophy, most notably his contribution to morality and ethics through the examining of the self. We must first preface the story of Socrates' trial with how we know about the life of this philosopher. Socrates himself never wrote down any of his philosophy, as he considered the spoken dialogue between participants as being an essential part of the philosophical examination of the self. All that we know of Socrates' teachings are what was recorded in the writings of his students, of which Plato is often regarded as the most reliable source of Socrates' philosophy. Although some debate persists with regard to his later works and whether Plato began using Socrates as a character in his writing to espouse his own ideas as they developed after his teacher's death. This, combined with another ongoing debate regarding the authorship of nearly half of the dialogues traditionally attributed to Plato, means that any information regarding Socrates, his life, and his philosophy should always be considered with these issues in mind. With regard to the trial of Socrates, these problems are much less pronounced, as Plato was present at the trial and presumably wrote his account shortly thereafter. Xenophon, another of Socrates' students, also wrote an account of Socrates' trial, but he was not present, instead relying on the first-hand account of his friend Hermogenes. As such, Plato's account is typically the version referred to when discussing the trial of Socrates. For those that are interested in the different accounts of Socrates himself, the existentialist philosopher Soren Kierkegaard dedicated the first half of his thesis, The Concept of Irony, to examining these differing versions of Socrates and who best represents his philosophy most accurately. Let us set the stage for Socrates' trial and imagine the scene of the courthouse on that day. In 399 BCE, some 70 years before the time of Alexander the Great, Athens was one of the many city-states in the area we now know as Greece, and had become known as a place of learning. Into the Athenian courthouse, 501 citizens were chosen to form a jury on the trial of the day. The odd number of 501, we can assume, was so that no vote could be tied. The man summoned for trial is Socrates, who is well known among the citizens of Athens as a man who would debate fellow citizens on their knowledge of ideas, particularly those who would specialise in a particular form of knowledge or craft. He describes himself as attaching himself to the city and occasionally stinging its inhabitants to awaken them from their daily lives to question those ideas and knowledges that they simply accept as fact without examination. It is easy to see why Socrates would make enemies doing this, undermining those ideas that citizens had built their crafts and livelihoods upon. The charges against Socrates were primarily brought by Anytus, an influential Athenian who, if the Platonic dialogue Meno is an accurate portrayal, was offended by Socrates, who accused influential Athenians such as Anytus of producing sons inferior to themselves. Anytus was also a vehement critic of the Sophists, a group of philosophers who spread their ideas of virtue among the young, and with whom Socrates was mistakenly attributed. Meletus was the second accuser, a poet who was perhaps persuaded by Anytus to join the accusers, due to his skills as a poet and persuasive orator, and is the only one who answers Socrates under cross-examination. The third accuser is Lycon, a speaker who associated Socrates with the enemies of the Athenian people, the Spartans. We shall return to the underlying grudges against Socrates that these accusers had later on. There are two charges brought against Socrates that he stood trial on. First was that Socrates had denied the gods of the city, in choosing instead to invent new gods to worship. The second charge was that of corruption of the young of Athens, specifically convincing them to follow his impious and blasphemous teachings. These charges would have been brought to an archon, a kind of religious judge who assessed charges and decided if there was sufficient reason or evidence to organise a trial. In this case, it seems they believed there was, and Socrates was ordered to stand trial. Part of the events leading up to the trial are described in Plato's dialogue Euphyphro, in which Socrates discusses the idea of holiness or piety with Euphyphro, who is bringing charge against his own father for causing the death of a servant. Returning to the trial of Socrates, Meletus and his co-accusers presented to the jurors a well-rehearsed speech, which was designed to rouse and convince the jurors of Socrates' guilt. Unfortunately, no record of the prosecution's speeches survive, and we are left only with what Socrates responded to in his own speech. Let us take a look at what he said. Socrates' Apology, or Apologia, would have been delivered after the prosecution's speeches had ended. The apology, in contrast to how we use the word today, was not asking for forgiveness, but rather the opportunity for a defendant to defend themselves against the charges brought against them, combined also with allowing them to cross-examine the accusers. As such, this was Socrates' chance to prove his innocence. Socrates begins with a response to one of Meletus's claims, that the jurors should not be deceived by an accomplished speaker such as himself. He instead attempts to portray his accusers as the accomplished speakers, who carefully chose their words to condemn him. In contrast, Socrates will simply tell the truth, using words that come to mind in the moment, in the manner the people of Athens will know him to speak. In doing so, Socrates is not adjusting the manner of speech for the setting of the trial. He is not changing his manner of speech to persuade or charm the jury, but to maintain his typical form of the practice of truth-telling, to be honest with oneself, and to encourage the jurors to be honest with themselves, to choose what they believe is right, rather than what Meletus, Anytus, or indeed Socrates believes to be right. He mentions that they all have been taught to believe that certain things are true by others, by the public speakers, the poets, the state, for example, and those preconceptions must be undone if they are to grasp what Socrates is saying. Now, attempting to prove your innocence by telling the jury not to be persuaded by what people say is perhaps an odd move, but this is entirely consistent with how Socrates has conducted himself in his life. In showing that he does not change the truth based on how or where he speaks, he does not need to embellish the truth to manipulate or control it. But that means he can also not present it to the jury, only undo what they believe the truth to be. Socrates has seemingly set the conditions of the trial himself. If he can accomplish his task and reveal to them the truth, the jurors will find him innocent. If they cannot, and they use their preconceived notion of truth, they will find him guilty. Socrates divides the accusers between those that are more recent, such as Anytus, and those which are more long withstanding, who have held a grudge against him for a long time. The former, Socrates claims, are the most dangerous. They got most of you from childhood, persuaded you and accused me quite falsely, saying that there is a man called Socrates, a wise man, a student of all things in the sky and below the earth, who makes the worst argument the stronger. Those who say these things are nameless, save for one Socrates shall mention momentarily. They are all shadows, public opinion, general consensus and gossip that pervade the city's streets and smuggle their ideas into the impressionable youth without challenge. It is Socrates who must address these shadows and superstitions, but he, obviously, cannot speak to them directly and engage them in conversation or cross-examination. He must ask others, the jury in this case, to challenge them for themselves, to free themselves from the grasp of shadows and public opinion. One of those who have spread such characterizations was Aristophanes, who, in his comedic play The Clouds, portrayed Socrates as a madman and a jester, who raved about the goings-on of what transpires in the clouds and beyond the realms of human existence. He warns the jurors against taking such a characterization as true, and also that many of the other shadows that describe Socrates are of the same nature. They actually have no basis in truth. He also answers the charge of philosophers charging fees for their services, which he does not do, but if others do, he does not see the problem, if they possess the knowledge to share, like any other form of knowledge. But Socrates, he says he does not have any knowledge to share. Now here is the core of Socrates' argument. What impious wisdom has he been spreading throughout the city? His answer? The wisdom of no wisdom. I shall retell Socrates' account in order to clear up this seemingly paradoxical statement. Chaerephon, a friend of Socrates, went to visit the oracle of Delphi, where people would go to learn their destiny. Chaerephon asked the oracle if there was anyone who was wiser than Socrates, to which they responded, "No one is wiser than Socrates." When Chaerephon told Socrates, he was puzzled by this statement, for he did not think he was the wisest at all. He eventually went to others in the city, those who were proclaimed to be wise, and experts in particular forms of knowledge or skills. Upon questioning them, Socrates came to a realization. These men were considered to be wise, but they also considered themselves to be wise. And when Socrates found out that they actually knew nothing upon questioning, they would not admit that they knew nothing. It was only Socrates himself who could admit that he knew nothing. He was the wisest because he knew that he knew nothing. Let's take a brief example. Socrates may visit a politician and ask him about the knowledge he possesses, the wisdom that gives him his profession and position within the city. The politician may answer, "I know about the law." Socrates may then ask, "But what is the law?" The politician responds, "It is the good." Socrates retorts, "But what is the good?" "It is virtue." "But what is virtue?" And so on. Socrates sounds like the annoying child who answers "why" to every single question that is put to him. But there is a serious point to make here. Eventually, the politician, the poet, the craftsman, or whoever says they possess a certain form of knowledge is forced to admit they know nothing about the foundation of their knowledge, that what they know does not make them wise. It is Socrates alone, he claims, that knows that he knows nothing, which is what the oracle meant when he said that he, Socrates, was the wisest. It is easy to see how Socrates uncovering that the powerful men of the city actually knew nothing about what made them powerful would have made him many enemies and hence being put on trial. Xenophon's account of the story is a little different. He claims that the advice Socrates received at the oracle was that no man was freer than me, or more just, or more moderate. Xenophon's Socrates does not seem concerned with philosophical wisdom, but rather his independence as a free man whose moderation is not taken or persuaded by the powers that be. Again, we shall return to Xenophon's account at the end, but it is important to note that it is Plato's Socrates that deals with philosophical notions of wisdom and ethics, as one's duty to uphold the truth to oneself, not any others, and as such it is his account that philosophy should be interested in. The Socrates that Plato describes, this man who knows nothing, is actually the one in service to the god, not disavowing them, because he alone knows that he knows nothing in comparison to the god's absolute knowledge, whereas others, in error, do believe that they possess such wisdom. Those who rely on such wisdom are the ones that are not in service to the god. They displace the god themselves with their supposed wisdom. Upon this path, Socrates continues to make his defence. He is accused of corrupting the youth, but when asked what knowledge he teaches them, no one can answer. Neither can they say, on the contrary, what knowledge they should be learning. Turning to Meletus, the only accuser Socrates cross-examines in Plato's account, he asks him what improves men, and Meletus says the people of the jury and the public improve men, and that Socrates alone corrupts them. If that is the case, why did Meletus not attempt to improve Socrates himself, rather than bringing him to the court to stand trial? If Socrates has corrupted the young and gave them bad advice, why has no one come to the court on this day to say so? Meletus cannot answer. So on the first charge against Socrates, that he does not follow the gods, he has shown that he does follow them by acknowledging that he knows nothing, and that wisdom is held by the gods exclusively. Secondly, that he is corrupting the young with his teachings, he has asked that anyone who has been misled by him, or knows any examples of his teachings, to come forward, which does not happen. Upon this, the jury must consider their verdict, that Socrates has defended his actions by showing that the foundation of his opponent's arguments are empty, and while his own are also empty, at least he recognises that, and his instructions should instruct the jurors to find a similar acknowledgement in themselves, and thus not find him guilty. Again, Socrates puts no wisdom forward in defence of himself, only the means for others to acknowledge the wisdom of the gods. So with this, the jury considered their verdict, and by a majority vote they have reached it. Socrates is guilty. By a majority of 30 votes, Socrates has been convicted of the charges brought against him. The jury has decided that Socrates has not led a quiet life, but has shunned what the people of the city find important: possessions, property, positions in society, and so on. Socrates is here meant to choose his punishment, but he finds none appropriate. He cannot promise to stop teaching his philosophy. It is the will of the gods, as he said. If he is exiled, he will continue his teaching elsewhere, and the jury would not believe that he has stopped anyway. He suggests that he should receive free meals at the city's Prytaneum, the hall where public feasts are held, for his service to the city. This boastful way of speaking perhaps does Socrates no favours, and Plato and his fellow students convince their teacher to suggest a modest fine that they will pay themselves. But he ultimately leaves the decision of punishment to the jury, since accepting any form of punishment would be an admittance of guilt. With this, the jury sentences Socrates to death. With the sentence of death, Socrates reflects on the damage the jurors have done to themselves. His sentence is of no concern. He is 70 years old and will die soon enough, and avoiding death at any cost would again not be true to himself. He does warn, however, that those members of the jury that chose to convict him must live with themselves for making this decision, rather than letting him live out his final years in peace. And also, even though he may die, the questioning will not stop after his death. His students will simply question others like never before. Even in death, Socrates says he will not stop his philosophy, and will go to the underworld to question the spirits of those who reside there. He leaves with only these words: "Now the hour to part has come. I go to die, you go to live. Which of us goes to the better lot is known to no one except the god." Until the end, Socrates offers no wisdom of what will follow, only to leave it in the hands of the gods, who keep that wisdom for themselves. Was Socrates' death justified? While he did not offer protestations of his innocence, as might be expected in a trial, Socrates nevertheless showed that the charges brought against him were mostly void of substance. The answer to his sentence perhaps lies beyond this trial. Athens had recently been liberated from Spartan rule, having lost the Peloponnesian War a few years earlier, and eventually casting out the oligarchs that Sparta had installed there. During the occupation, Socrates had remained in Athens, unlike many others, and although he did not submit to Spartan rule and follow their orders, his reluctance to leave the city may have been seen as supporting the occupying forces. Socrates also associated with a number of people who supported the Spartans, including his mentor Alcibiades, who led the Athenian army to defeat and then defected to Sparta. But again, Socrates seemingly distanced himself from those who supported the Spartans in public. The details of Socrates' associations is a complex web that we shall not go into here, but there was undoubtedly some resentment still toward the Spartans and anyone associated with them, and it seems Socrates would have been a prime target for that resentment. It seems that Socrates had little chance of escaping his fate in this trial, and he probably knew it. The Socrates described by Plato is one who is concerned with an ethical care for the self. The truth is not swayed by politics, gossip, or public opinion, but must be safeguarded against the sly words of the public, who have an altogether different conception of truth that they wish to instill in impressionable minds. Not even in the biggest distinction of all, between life and death, does Socrates change his ways. Whether alive or dead, he will simply continue to practice the wisdom given to him by the god. He also discusses this in Plato's dialogue Crito, which describes Socrates' final moments as he drinks the poison hemlock which will kill him, but that is another story. The Socrates described by Xenophon is perhaps not a philosopher at all. Recall earlier that the oracle's words, according to Xenophon, were that no man was freer than me, or more just, or more moderate. Xenophon sees Socrates as simply a free man who distinguishes himself from the trivialities of daily life, to be himself unfettered by public opinion. It is likely Xenophon saw himself in Socrates and wrote a more robust defence of Socrates' life as also a defence of his own. Another curious difference between Xenophon and Plato is that Xenophon makes the argument that Socrates actually wanted to be sentenced to death at the trial, that this lack of a typical defence was intentional, and he should die while he is still able-bodied, rather than withering away in old age. Another difference is the daemon that Socrates mentions who guides his actions. In Plato's account, it is a voice that warns away from such actions, thereby telling him nothing. But Xenophon mentions this daemon as instructing Socrates on a course of action. It is likely in both cases that this is where the first charge of inventing new gods might have emerged. Xenophon's account is very much focused on trying to absolve Socrates and justify his behaviour, perhaps fearing Xenophon himself could face the same fate as his teacher. As such, the Socrates that Xenophon describes does not have the philosophical impact that Plato's does. Socrates is often regarded as the founder of Western philosophy. He speaks of things no one can speak of. He engages in dialogue to dispel the shadows of gossip, opinion, and unfounded general consensus to uncover a way to speak truth. His experiences influence Plato's later writings, in which he criticises the idea of democracy as majority opinion, the very type that sentenced Socrates to death, and that instead rulers should be philosopher kings, whose wisdom can guide the state. Also, Plato's criticism of the arts and poetry may stem from Socrates' portrayal by the poet Aristophanes, who satirised him in his play Clouds, mentioned at the beginning, and Meletus, the poet who accused Socrates in court. Whether these were Socrates' own ideas or ones developed by Plato after his teacher's death, Plato's works became the basis of Western philosophy. Intertwined with religion, it became a framework that explained and justified how the world operated, both in terms of metaphysics and ethics. This also taught people what was good, how they should behave ethically, what was a sin and what was not. Things which Socrates himself critiqued in the form of men in positions of power who knew nothing at their core. But there were those who took up Socrates' dedication to the truth, philosophers and scientists who sought to uncover truth about the world, similarly persecuted by church and state, of not believing in God, find a kinship in Socrates, who make enemies, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not, simply by pursuing the love of wisdom that makes up philosophy. Pushing beyond established truth and preconceived knowledge, they sought new ways of understanding the world and the self. Even though Socrates preached nothing, he was true in his words at the end of his trial, that those who would silence him would be questioned like never before, and even over 2,000 years after his death, his philosophy of not merely accepting the word of the gods, but to test and pursue it, is still alive in philosophy today.